Tonight, we unravel a story from the gilded ballrooms of Regency London, a tale of love, duty, and a devastating secret. Meet Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who possessed everything: title, fortune, and the hand of the most beautiful debutante of the season, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth. He believed his life was a portrait of perfection. But perfection can be a fragile illusion. On the night of their engagement ball, driven by a desire to see his bride not as a duchess-in-waiting, but as the woman he was beginning to love, he commits a single, fateful act. He hides himself among the crowd. What he overhears in a quiet moment, shielded by potted palms, is a whispered confession that will not just break his heart, but shatter the very foundations of his world. The Beaumont House ballroom was a galaxy of earthly stars. 1,000 candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000,000 diamonds that danced across shimmering silks, polished marble, and the jewels adorning the cream of London society. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and hothouse roses, hummed with the refined symphony of a string quartet and the murmur of pedigreed gossip. At the center of this universe stood its son, Alistair Beaumont, the 10th Duke of Blackwood. At 32, Alistair was the epitome of his station, tall, with a bearing that spoke of generations of command. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and his black evening coat, tailored by the renowned John Weston, fit his broad shoulders to perfection. His face, often perceived as severe in its handsome, angular lines, was tonight softened by a rare, genuine smile. His gaze kept finding its way across the room to the woman who was the cause of that smile, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, his fiancée. Eleanor was breathtaking, a vision in ivory silk, with pearls woven into her intricate auburn hair. She moved through the crowd with a grace that seemed both innate and meticulously practiced. Her laughter, a light and musical sound, reached him even over the din. She was the daughter of the Earl of Ainsworth, a celebrated beauty with a flawless reputation. Their match was deemed the event of the season, a perfect union of title, beauty, and influence. Alistair knew it was a good match. It was his duty to marry, to produce an heir, to secure the Blackwood line. He had chosen Eleanor for all the right reasons: her impeccable lineage, her poise, her intelligence. He had expected to feel a sense of satisfaction, of duty fulfilled. What he had not expected was the quiet, insistent way she was beginning to occupy his thoughts, to stir something in the guarded chambers of his heart. He found himself mesmerized by the way her emerald eyes would flash with wit during their chaperoned conversations, the gentle curve of her lips when she thought no one was watching. He was beginning to fall in love with his own fiancée, a prospect that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. He wanted, more than anything, to know if any of it was real. Did she feel this nascent, burgeoning affection too? Or was he just the Duke of Blackwood, the grand prize she had dutifully won? The Tun was a stage, and they were all actors playing their parts. He longed for a glimpse behind the curtain. A sudden, impulsive idea took root, an idea unbecoming of a duke, but irresistible to the man. He wanted to see her when she was not performing for him. He wanted to be invisible, a ghost in his own house, and simply observe the woman he was to marry. Making a quiet excuse to his friend, Viscount Strickland, about needing a moment of air, Alistair slipped away from the main throng. He didn't head for the grand terrace, but instead for a small antechamber used by the staff. There, he intercepted a footman of similar height and build, a young man named James. With a flash of gold coins and a hushed, commanding tone, an exchange was made. Alistair shed his ducal coat for the plain, dark livery of a household servant. He kept to the shadows, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of apprehension and thrill. He was no longer the host, the duke, the centre of attention. He was just a man, hidden in plain sight. He took a tray of empty champagne flutes from a nearby table, using it as a prop. His face, known to every member of society, was now merely part of the background, his features unremarkable without the aura of his title. He moved along the perimeter of the ballroom, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. He watched her speak with her friends, Lady Beatrice Croft and Lady Annabel Finch. He saw her smile, a dazzling, public smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He saw the subtle tension in her shoulders. He felt a pang of guilt. This was a violation of her privacy, a deception. But the desire to know the truth, the real truth of her feelings, was a hunger too sharp to ignore. He drifted closer to a secluded alcove near the conservatory, where the music was softer and guests often retreated for more private conversations. It was there he saw Eleanor, her back to the ballroom, speaking with her closest cousin, the sharp-tongued and pragmatic Lady Beatrice. He positioned himself behind a large marble column and a towering potted fern, pretending to collect a discarded glass. He was close enough to hear their whispers, and what he was about to hear would become the dagger that vivisected his world. The alcove was a small island of relative quiet, shielded by a marble column and the lush green fronds of a fern. Lady Eleanor Ainsworth finally let the mask of serene perfection slip. She pressed her gloved fingers to her temples, a gesture of profound weariness that no one in the main ballroom would ever see. Her cousin, Beatrice Croft, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, took a sip of her champagne. "You're playing your part beautifully, Elle. The adoring fiancée, the blushing bride-to-be. You almost have me convinced." Eleanor let out a sigh that was closer to a shudder. "Don't, Beatrice. Not tonight." "Why not?" Beatrice's voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper. "It's a triumph. Look at them all, fawning and staring. You've done it. You've captured the biggest prize in England, the Duke of Blackwood. So serious, so stoic. He looks at you as though you're a goddess descended from Olympus." Alistair, hidden just feet away, felt a flush of warmth at Beatrice's words. That was how he felt. He leaned in, shamefully eager to hear Eleanor's response, hoping for a shy agreement, a whispered confession of her own growing feelings. But Eleanor's reply was not what he expected. It was brittle, cold as ice. "A goddess on an altar of sacrifice, perhaps. He is a duke, Beatrice. That is all he needs to be." Beatrice arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "And is that all he is to you? A title? A vault of gold? Come now, you can be honest with me." Eleanor turned slightly, her profile etched against the soft candlelight. The expression on her face was not one of love or even affection. It was one of grim, steely resolve. "He is the key," she said, her voice dropping to a near hiss, venomous in its clarity. "Blackwood is the key that unlocks the cage our family is in. His name, his power, his fortune, they are the tools I will use to secure our future. Nothing more." The blood in Alistair's veins turned to slush. He remained frozen, his hand gripping the silver tray so tightly his knuckles were white. Each word was a physical blow. Beatrice laughed, a short, sharp sound. "And what of the man himself? He's not entirely odious to look at. Surely there is some small part of you that is pleased." Eleanor gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "He is tolerable. He is honourable, which makes him predictable. He is dutiful, which makes him manageable. He speaks of poetry and art, but his soul is made of ledgers and responsibility. I will be a perfect duchess, run his homes, spare his heir. In return, I will have security. That is the bargain." "And love?" Beatrice pressed, her voice laced with a cruel sort of curiosity. "What of Mr. Sterling? I saw him earlier, lurking by the card room. He looked as though he were attending a funeral." At the mention of another man's name, Thomas Sterling, a respectable but penniless barrister's son Eleanor had known since childhood, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. It was a fleeting, agonizing pain that she quickly suppressed. "Mr. Sterling is a ghost," she said, her voice hardening again. "A pleasant memory from a life I can no longer afford to live. Love is a luxury, Beatrice, a currency for silly girls who believe in fairy tales. I am not a silly girl. I am a survivor." She straightened her shoulders, her spine turning to steel. "The Duke is a means to an end, a stepping stone out of a mire of debt and disgrace that would swallow our family whole. I will smile, I will be charming, and I will be the best damn duchess this country has ever seen. But do not for 1 second mistake my performance for passion. My heart is not part of the marriage contract." The finality in her tone was absolute. There was no ambiguity, no room for misunderstanding. Behind the column, Alistair felt as if the marble floor had dropped away from beneath him. The heat and noise of the ball faded into a dull, distant roar. All he could hear was the echo of her words. A means to an end. Tolerable, predictable, manageable. My heart is not part of the marriage contract. The nascent love that had been blooming within him withered and died in an instant, flash-frozen by the Arctic chill of her confession. He had wanted to see behind the curtain, and he had. What he found there was not a woman learning to love him, but a cold, calculating strategist celebrating a successful campaign. He was not a man to her. He was a title, a key, a solution to a problem he hadn't even known existed. He felt a fool, a naive, sentimental fool. The Duke of Blackwood played and won like a hand of cards. Slowly, mechanically, he forced his limbs to move. He retreated from the alcove, his steps silent and measured. He placed the tray on a table, his movements stiff and robotic. He walked back to the antechamber, his mind a maelstrom of humiliation and a pain so sharp it felt like a physical wound in his chest. He shed the servant's livery, the simple cloth feeling like a costume from a farce, and donned his own ducal coat. The fine wool felt heavy, like a suit of armor he was now forced to wear. He stepped back into the ballroom. The music swelled, the diamonds glittered, and across the room, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, his beautiful, treacherous fiancée, smiled at him. It was the same smile from before, but now he saw it for what it was. A masterpiece of deception, a lie rendered in flesh and blood. And as he met her gaze and forced his own lips into a semblance of a smile, his heart shattered into 1,000 icy shards. Returning to the heart of the ballroom was like resurfacing into a world that had suddenly lost all its color and warmth. The music that had sounded celebratory now seemed jarring and hollow. The glittering assembly of guests looked like a collection of puppets, their smiles painted on, their movements meaningless. Alistair felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were a ghost haunting his own life. He moved through the crowd, a polite nod here, a tight-lipped smile there. Every congratulatory remark from a well-meaning acquaintance felt like a turn of the knife. "You've found a true diamond, Your Grace," Lord Ashworth boomed, clapping him on the shoulder. Alistair flinched internally, but managed a response that sounded civil, if clipped. "She is indeed a remarkable woman." Remarkably deceptive, his mind screamed. His eyes found Eleanor again. She was now engaged in conversation with the French ambassador. She gestured elegantly with her fan, her expression one of intelligent interest. To everyone else, she was the picture of grace. To him, she was a predator, her beauty a lure, her charm a carefully constructed trap. He watched the subtle play of muscles in her face, the calculated warmth in her eyes, and felt a cold fury building beneath his shock. He had been played for the worst kind of fool, an emotional one. He had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to hope for something real in the gilded cage of the aristocracy, and she had exposed that hope as a pathetic weakness. Viscount Strickland, his oldest friend, approached him, a concerned look on his face. "Alistair, are you quite well? You look as though you've seen a spectre." "Perhaps I have," Alistair replied, his voice flat. He took a glass of brandy from a passing servant and downed it in one go, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the ice in his veins. "Was it the air you required, or something stronger?" Strickland asked, his tone shifting from light to serious. He knew Alistair well enough to recognize that this was not a fleeting mood. "Clarity, Thomas. I went seeking clarity," Alistair said, his gaze locked on Eleanor across the room. "And I found it in abundance." Before Strickland could inquire further, the orchestra struck the opening chords of a waltz. It was the waltz he had promised Eleanor. As if on cue, she gracefully excused herself from the ambassador and began to make her way toward him, her path cleared by deferential guests. Her smile brightened as she approached him, a perfect imitation of a bride-to-be eager for a dance with her beloved. "Your Grace," she said, her voice the same melodic tone he had once found so enchanting. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me." "That would be impossible, my lady," he replied. The formal address felt strange on his lips after weeks of using her given name in their private, chaperoned meetings. His voice was devoid of warmth, a stark contrast to the easy affection he'd shown her earlier in the evening. He saw a flicker of confusion in her emerald eyes, a momentary faltering of her composure, before it was perfectly restored. He offered his arm stiffly, and a murmur of appreciation went through the nearby guests as he led her to the center of the floor. He placed one hand on her waist, the silk of her gown cool beneath his glove. He could feel the warmth of her body through the fabric, and the contact was repulsive to him. He took her hand, his grip formal and impersonal. As the music swelled, they began to move. They had practiced the waltz. In their previous turns around the dance floor, he had held her close, whispering observations about the other guests, making her laugh. He had felt the gentle pressure of her hand in his, and it had felt like a promise. Now he held her at a rigid, formal distance. He guided her through the steps with flawless, mechanical precision, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic indifference. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He stared over her head at a point on the far wall, his jaw tight. The change in him was so abrupt, so stark, that Eleanor could not ignore it. "Is something amiss, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice quiet, meant for his ears alone. "You seem distant." "I am merely contemplating the responsibilities of my station," he said, his voice a low, chilling monotone. "An evening such as this serves as a potent reminder of one's duties." His words were a veiled reference to their overheard conversation, a test. He watched for her reaction. He saw another flash of confusion, a hint of hurt, but she masked it quickly. "Of course," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "Our duty is paramount." Our duty. The word was a confirmation. For him, the duty was to his lineage, his title. For her, it was to her family's finances. They were both fulfilling a duty, just not the same one. They continued to dance in silence. The silence stretched, growing heavier and more awkward with each turn. The other couples on the floor were a blur of motion and colour. For Alistair and Eleanor, their personal world had shrunk to this cold, silent space between them. He could feel the stares of the ton, could sense their whispers. The Duke and his fiancée, the perfect couple, were suddenly a picture of frosty distantness. When the final notes of the waltz faded, he released her with a speed that was just shy of insulting. He gave a curt, formal bow. "My lady," he said, and without offering his arm to escort her from the floor, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the ballroom. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the onlookers. It was a brutal, public snub. Eleanor stood frozen for a second, her face pale. He saw the shock, the humiliation warring in her eyes. But then, with a strength he had to grudgingly admire, she regained her composure. She lifted her chin, gave a graceful, almost imperceptible nod, as if this were perfectly normal, and glided toward her mother, the Countess of Ainsworth, who was watching with a horrified expression. Alistair didn't care. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted her to feel a fraction of the humiliation, the shattering betrayal he felt. He had put on his own mask now, a mask of ice, and he vowed that she would never again see the man behind it. The game she had started was one he would now finish, but on his own terms. The engagement would continue, for now. A public scandal was unthinkable, but the wedding, the union, the life she thought she had secured, that was now a battlefield. The days that followed the engagement ball were a study in cold civility. To the outside world, the Duke and his fiancée were proceeding as planned. The wedding date was set. Invitations were being engraved. Gifts were arriving at Beaumont House daily. But within the fragile bubble of their courtship, an Arctic winter had set in. Alistair was a master of passive aggression. He attended the required dinners and theatre outings, but he was a changed man. His conversation was unfailingly polite and utterly impersonal. He discussed politics with her father, the weather with her mother, and addressed Eleanor only when absolutely necessary, his eyes holding a detached, frosty glare that made her visibly flinch. The easy warmth, the shared jokes, the glimmers of genuine affection were gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of ducal formality. Eleanor was bewildered, and, Alistair noted with a grim sense of satisfaction, increasingly distressed. She tried, on several occasions, to breach his defences. "Alistair, have I done something to offend you?" she asked one afternoon, during a stiflingly formal tea at her family's London residence. He looked at her, his expression as unyielding as granite. "Why would you think that, Lady Eleanor? The wedding preparations proceed apace. Our families are pleased. Our duty is being met. Is that not the purpose of this arrangement?" His use of her full title was a deliberate slap, a reminder of the transactional nature of their union as she herself had defined it. He saw the hurt in her eyes before she masked it. "Of course, Your Grace," she murmured, retreating into a shell of polite silence. His coldness was a torment to her, and that was his intention. But as the weeks passed, something began to gnaw at him. His initial white-hot fury began to cool, leaving behind the cold, hard ache of betrayal. And in that quieter state, small, incongruous details began to surface in his mind. He remembered the flicker of genuine pain on her face when Beatrice had mentioned Thomas Sterling. It wasn't the look of a woman callously discarding a former lover. It was the look of deep, unresolved grief. A survivor, she had called herself. Why that word? It implied a battle, a struggle against some unseen force. He also found himself unable to reconcile the calculating woman from the alcove with the Eleanor he had known before that night. The woman who had passionately debated philosophy with him, who had shown a surprising and tender knowledge of tenant farming on his estates, who had once spent an entire afternoon helping one of his young groomsmen patiently coax a frightened mare. Those moments had felt real, unscripted. Were they all part of the performance? Was she truly that skilled an actress? His ducal mind, trained in logic and assessment, began to demand more than the raw emotion of his wounded heart. He needed facts. He needed to understand the full scope of the game he was in. Without a word to anyone, he summoned his solicitor, Mr. Davies, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man whose family had served the Blackwoods for a century. "Davies," Alistair began, seated behind the imposing mahogany desk in his study, "I require a complete and utterly confidential overview of the financial state of the Earl of Ainsworth." Davies, a man who never showed surprise, simply nodded. "I see, Your Grace. May I inquire as to the delicate nature of the request?" "The nature is that I am to marry his daughter," Alistair said flatly. "I wish to know exactly what I am marrying into. Debts, assets, investments, creditors, everything. And I want it done so quietly that God himself doesn't know you're looking." While Davies began his discreet work, Alistair conducted his own, more subtle investigation. He began paying closer attention to the Earl of Ainsworth. The man was bluff and jovial in public, but Alistair now noticed the sheen of sweat on his brow in the card rooms at White's, the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted a glass of port. He was a man under immense strain. The true seed of doubt, however, was planted at a soirée hosted by the Marchioness of Salisbury. Alistair was observing Eleanor from across the room. She was, as always, poised and elegant, a diamond of the first water. Then a man entered the room, and the change in her was immediate and profound. He was Lord Caspian Thorne, a man with a reputation as slick and dangerous as black ice. He was handsome in a predatory way, his charm too polished, his smile never quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. He was notoriously wealthy, having made a fortune through unspecified and likely unsavory ventures. As Thorne approached Eleanor's group, Alistair saw her spine stiffen. The colour drained from her face. Her fan, which had been moving in a gentle, rhythmic motion, stilled in her hand. Her smile became a brittle, painted thing. Thorne bowed over her hand, his lips lingering a moment too long. Alistair watched as Eleanor subtly pulled her hand back, a look of pure, undiluted fear, quickly masked, flashing in her eyes before she composed herself. Thorne said something to her, his voice too low for Alistair to hear, but his posture was proprietary, almost menacing. Eleanor simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Thorne's shoulder. The interaction lasted no more than a minute, but the tension was palpable. Alistair had never seen Eleanor look afraid. Not once. She was always composed, always in control. But in the presence of Lord Thorne, her carefully constructed facade had cracked, revealing a terrifying vulnerability beneath. Why was she afraid of him? What hold did this man have over her? The question echoed in his mind, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. The simple narrative of the cold-hearted social climber was beginning to fray at the edges. A new, more sinister picture was emerging, and he was realizing, with a dawning sense of dread, that the whispered conversation he had overheard might not have been the whole truth. It may have only been a single, horrifying chapter in a much darker story. His shattered heart, which had been nursing its own wounds, began to feel a different emotion stirring in its depths, a cold, protective curiosity. From within the silken prison of her life, Eleanor Ainsworth felt she was suffocating. The Duke's inexplicable coldness was a constant, sharp pain. Each day was a trial, forcing her to maintain a serene facade for society, while her inner world crumbled. She had steeled herself for a marriage of convenience, prepared to be a dutiful, respected duchess to a man she could respect in turn. She had not been prepared for this icy contempt from the very man she was sacrificing everything for. His sudden change had left her reeling. One moment, he was looking at her with a warmth that made her dare to hope this arrangement might be more than just tolerable. The next, he was a stranger, looking through her as if she were made of glass. Had she misspoken? Had she inadvertently caused some grave offense? The uncertainty was a torment, adding another layer of weight to the impossible burden she already carried. That burden had a name: Lord Caspian Thorn. A week after the encounter at the Salisbury soiree, a note arrived for Eleanor. The wax seal bore Thorn's ostentatious crest. Her hands trembled as she broke it. The message was brief and not a request. The Ainsworth Garden. Midnight. Do not be late. That night, she slipped out of the house, a dark cloak hiding her pale nightdress. The moon was a sliver of silver in a cloudy sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. She found him by the old stone sundial, a dark silhouette against the gloom. "My lord," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is incredibly reckless." Thorn turned, and even in the dim light, she could see the cruel amusement in his eyes. "Reckless? My dear Lady Eleanor, I would call it a creditor visiting his investment, a substantial investment at that." He stepped closer, and she fought the urge to retreat. He smelled of brandy and expensive cologne, a cloying combination. "Your father, I'm afraid, has had another run of bad luck at the tables," Thorn said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Deepened his hole, so to speak. My generosity, however, is not without its limits." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "The arrangement stands. I am to marry the Duke. His fortune will settle my father's debts to you. You gave us your word." "Ah, yes. The mighty Duke of Blackwood," Thorn mused, circling her like a shark. "A fine solution, a tidy end to a messy business. But I have been observing you too. The chill between you is palpable. Rumors are beginning to circulate. What if the stoic Duke decides to cry off? What if your charms, my dear, are not sufficient to see this deal to its conclusion?" "He will not," Eleanor said, infusing her voice with a conviction she did not feel. "The engagement is a matter of public record. To break it would cause a scandal of the highest order. The Duke is a man of honor. He would never—" Thorn laughed, a low, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "Honor? Honor is a luxury for men who have nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, have everything to lose. Your family's name, your father's freedom, your dear sister, Annabel's future." At the mention of her younger sister, a wave of nausea washed over Eleanor. Annabel was 17, bright-eyed and innocent, poised for her first season. The thought of Thorn's shadow falling over her was unbearable. "What do you want?" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. He stopped in front of her, his proximity overwhelming. He reached out and traced her jawline with a single finger, a touch that felt like a brand. She stood rigid, repulsed. "I am beginning to think I made a poor bargain," he said softly, his voice dangerously smooth. "Why should I settle for your father's debt paid in cold, impersonal gold, when I could have the jewel of the season for myself? Perhaps I should call in my markers. Have your father arrested, his estates seized. The Ainsworth name would be dragged through the mud so thoroughly it would never recover. Annabel's prospects would be ruined, and you, my dear, in your desperation, you would have nowhere else to turn. It was the threat he had been holding over her from the very beginning. Marry the Duke and settle the debt, or he would destroy them and take her amidst the ruins. Tears of helpless rage pricked at her eyes. You are a monster. I am a businessman, he corrected her smoothly, and I am merely reconsidering the terms of our agreement. Ensure this wedding happens, Lady Eleanor. Make your Duke happy. Play the loving bride. Because if you fail, the price will be far higher than you can ever imagine. I will be watching. He gave her a final, chilling smile before melting back into the shadows, leaving her alone by the sundial, trembling and trapped. She stumbled back to the house, the cold night air doing nothing to quell the fire of her panic. This was the truth she could never speak. This was the cage Alistair could never see. Her performance for Beatrice at the ball, the cold, calculating words, had been a desperate attempt to armor herself. She had been trying to convince herself as much as her cousin that she could do it, that she could reduce this monumental sacrifice to a simple transaction. If she could pretend it was about power and not desperation, about ambition and not fear, perhaps she could survive it. She had needed to believe she was a strategist in control, not a pawn being sacrificed. But her cruel words, meant to build a wall around her own breaking heart, had inadvertently created a chasm between her and Alistair. Now, caught between Thorne's predatory threats and the Duke's icy disdain, Eleanor felt the walls of her gilded cage closing in, and for the first time, she truly believed there was no way out. Mr. Davies worked with the chilling efficiency for which he was known. 3 weeks after Alistair had given him the task, the solicitor requested an urgent, late-night meeting. He arrived at Beaumont House, carrying a single, slender folio, tied with a black ribbon. "Your Grace," Davies said, forgoing any pleasantries as he laid the folio on the Duke's desk. "The financial state of the Earl of Ainsworth is, to put it mildly, catastrophic." Alistair sat back in his chair, his face grim in the lamplight. "Define catastrophic." "The Earl is a ruin," Davies stated bluntly. "Gambling debts mostly, mortgages on every property, loans against future harvests. He has been living on credit and fumes for years. But the bulk of his debt, the truly crushing portion, is held by a single creditor." Davies paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the silent study. "The debt is held by Lord Caspian Thorne." The name landed like a stone in the quiet room. Alistair's hands, which had been resting on the arms of his chair, clenched into fists. The scene at the soirée, Eleanor's pale face, the flash of fear in her eyes, slammed into his mind with brutal clarity. "How much?" Alistair asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough to see the Earl in debtor's prison for the rest of his life, Your Grace. Enough to seize every last acre of Ainsworth land and sell the family's possessions on the street. Lord Thorne holds the Ainsworth family in the palm of his hand. He can crush them at will." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more complex and horrifying than simple greed. Alistair thought back to the conversation he had overheard. The Duke is a means to an end, a stepping stone out of a mire of debt and disgrace that would swallow our family whole. The words, which had once sounded so callously ambitious, now sounded desperate. It hadn't been a confession of greed, it had been a statement of fact, a grim summary of her only available strategy for survival. "Tell me about Thorne," Alistair commanded. "He is a master of the predatory loan," Davies explained. "He extends credit to financially distressed gentlemen of good standing, often encouraging their vices. When they are in deep enough, he leverages the debt not for money, but for influence, information, or other assets. There are whispers of blackmail, of men ruined overnight. He is utterly ruthless, but legally impregnable. He ensures every contract is ironclad. Alistair stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark, sleeping city. His mind was racing, re-evaluating everything he had witnessed over the past weeks. Eleanor's tension, her father's nervousness, her fear of Thorn, her quiet desperation, and his own cold, cruel behavior in response to what he had thought was her betrayal. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. He had been so consumed by his own wounded pride that he had been blind. He had seen her as a villain when she was, in fact, a victim, a captive. She wasn't marrying him for his title. She was marrying him to save her family from a monster. The sacrifice she was making was immense, and he had punished her for it. He remembered her words about Mr. Sterling, a ghost from a life I can no longer afford to live. He had assumed she was being callous. Now he understood. She had been forced to give up the man she might have truly loved, forced to entomb her own heart, all to protect her family. The strength that must have taken, the solitary courage. It was staggering. The ice around his heart didn't just melt, it shattered. The pain of betrayal was replaced by a white-hot, protective fury directed squarely at Lord Thorn. And beneath that fury was a burgeoning emotion he had not felt before. A profound, overwhelming admiration for Eleanor Ainsworth. She was not the shallow socialite he had believed her to be. She was a warrior, fighting a silent, desperate war with the only weapons she had. He had misjudged her completely. He had been cruel, distant, and unforgiving when she had needed an ally most. The guilt was a heavy weight, but it was overshadowed by a new, unshakable resolve. "Davies," he said, turning from the window, his eyes blazing with a cold fire, "your investigation is not over. I no longer care about the Ainsworth's debts. I want you to find me every dirty secret, every questionable contract, every skeleton in Lord Caspian Thorn's closet. I want leverage. I want a weapon." "Your Grace," Davies said, a hint of alarm in his voice. "To move against a man like Thorn is—" "Thorn has threatened my future Duchess," Alistair cut in, his voice ringing with the authority of 10 generations of Blackwood dukes. "He has made this my affair. I am not interested in paying my fiancé's family debts. I am interested in utterly and completely destroying the man who holds them." The game had changed. It was no longer about a broken heart or a fractured engagement. A predator had targeted his family, and Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, was about to go to war. Alistair did not sleep. The information from Davies churned in his mind, fueling a potent mixture of guilt and rage. He could no longer bear the charade of cold civility. He had to speak to Eleanor, not to the polished lady of the ton, but to the woman fighting a desperate battle in secret. The next afternoon, he arrived at the Ainsworth residence unannounced, a breach of protocol that sent a flutter of panic through the household staff. He was shown into the morning room, where Eleanor was arranging flowers. She looked up at his entrance, her expression guarded, her eyes immediately wary. She was paler than usual, with faint, dark circles beneath her eyes that her composure could not quite conceal. "Your Grace," she said, her voice strained. "This is an unexpected visit." He dismissed the hovering maid with a sharp gesture. The door clicked shut, leaving them alone in the sunlit room. The scent of roses and lilies filled the air, a sweet fragrance that was at odds with the suffocating tension. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He walked toward her, his gaze intense, and stopped a few feet away. "We need to speak, Eleanor. Honestly. The time for games is over." The use of her given name, for the first time in weeks, made her start. She placed a white rose into the vase, her hand trembling slightly. "I am not certain what you mean." He could see the walls going up, the mask of polite confusion settling over her features. He would not allow it. He had to break through. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "I know about the debts. I know about your father's ruin." Her hand froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving it a stark, porcelain white. She looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. "And I know about Lord Caspian Thorn," he continued, pressing his advantage, his voice softening with an empathy she hadn't heard in an eternity. "I know he holds your family's fate in his hands, and I know he is the reason you agreed to marry me." It was as if he had physically struck her. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and she stumbled back a step, her carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. The vase of flowers wobbled, but she didn't notice. All her energy was focused on him, her expression a maelstrom of fear, shame, and utter devastation. How could you know?" she whispered, her voice ragged. "I made it my business to know," he said. He took a step closer. He wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but he knew he hadn't earned that right. "Eleanor, that night at the ball, I was not myself. I overheard you, in the alcove with your cousin Beatrice." The last of her defenses crumbled. She understood now. His coldness, his distance, it all made a terrible, perfect sense. She squeezed her eyes shut, shame and humiliation washing over her in a sickening wave. "So you know," she breathed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You know it all. That I am a liar. That I trapped you. That this was all a transaction." "No," he said, his voice firm, compelling her to open her eyes. She did, and what she saw in his expression was not the contempt she expected. It was not anger or disgust. It was a deep, aching regret. "I thought I knew. I let my pride and my hurt blind me. I heard your words, but I didn't understand the truth behind them. I have spent weeks treating you with a coldness you did not deserve. I was cruel, and for that, I am more sorry than I can ever say." Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. She did not bother to wipe them away. "You should not be sorry. What I said was unforgivable. What you said was the desperate armor of a woman trying to save her family," he countered, his voice raw with emotion. "You've been carrying this burden entirely alone, sacrificing your own happiness, your own heart, for them. You faced a monster and made an impossible choice. Eleanor, that is not deceit. That is a courage I can barely comprehend." He finally closed the distance between them, gently taking her hands in his. They were ice cold. "You do not have to do this alone anymore," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "Let me help you. Let me fight for you." She stared at him, bewildered, searching his face for any sign of deception. All she saw was sincerity, a fierce protectiveness that stole her breath away. The kindness in his eyes, after weeks of icy disdain, was her undoing. A lifetime of suppressed fear, of quiet desperation, of heartbreaking sacrifice, came pouring out in a torrent of sobs. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with the force of her weeping, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. He didn't speak, just held her as she cried, stroking her hair, absorbing the depth of her pain and fear. He had shattered her world with his coldness, but now he would remake it. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she looked up at him, her face tear-streaked, her eyes red but clear. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? Breaking the engagement would free you from this mess." "Breaking our engagement is the last thing on my mind," he said, his voice thick with a feeling that went far beyond admiration. "Because I have been a fool, Eleanor. I was beginning to fall in love with the woman I thought you were. But the woman you truly are, strong, selfless, fiercely loyal, she is the woman I know I can't live without." He made his choice in that moment. It wasn't about duty or honor anymore. It wasn't even about revenge against Thorn. It was about her. He would not be the key to her cage. He would be the man who broke it open and set her free. And he would spend the rest of his life earning the heart she had been forced to lock away. Alistair Beaumont was not a man who did things by halves. The Duke's gambit against Lord Thorn was a masterclass in silent, systematic destruction. Using the information unearthed by his solicitor and leveraging his own immense political and financial power, Alistair began to dismantle Thorn's empire. He discreetly bought up the debts of Thorn's other victims, offering them clemency in exchange for testimony. He fed information about Thorn's illegal smuggling operations to the right people at the Treasury. He used his influence in the House of Lords to launch an inquiry into predatory lending practices, with Thorn as the unspoken target. Within a month, Lord Caspian Thorn was ruined. His reputation was shattered, his creditors were closing in, and he was forced to flee the country, a pariah to the society he had preyed upon. Alistair never confronted him directly. He simply removed him from the board, a powerful, invisible hand sweeping a corrupt piece away. The Ainsworth debts were quietly settled by an anonymous benefactor, freeing the family from their prison of fear. With the shadow of Thorn gone, Alistair and Eleanor's courtship began anew, this time built not on duty or desperation, but on a foundation of radical honesty. He confessed the full depth of his foolish pride. She confessed the full extent of her fears and the quiet grief she held for the life she'd had to give up. They didn't fall in love amidst the glittering ballrooms, but in the quiet moments of shared vulnerability, in long walks through the gardens, in hushed conversations by the fire, in the slow, patient rebuilding of trust. Their wedding day dawned bright and clear. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she was not a sacrifice or a survivor. She was a radiant bride, her smile genuine, her eyes shining with a love that was real and freely given. When she met Alistair at the altar, he saw not a prize he had won, but a partner he would cherish. He was not just the Duke she had to marry, but the man she chose to love. Their union, once a cold contract overheard in the shadows, had been forged in the fires of adversity and transformed into a love story more powerful and true than any fairy tale. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. The story of Duke Alistair and Lady Eleanor is a powerful reminder that what we see on the surface is often just a mask, and that true love isn't about perfection, but about having the courage to look past a person's secrets and see their scars. It's about fighting for them when they can no longer fight for themselves. If their story of betrayal, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption moved you, please show your support by giving this video a like. Don't forget to share it with fellow lovers of history and romance, and to ensure you don't miss our next tale from the annals of the past, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have so many more secrets to uncover together. Until next time, thank you for listening.